Thank you for those songs. It's good to be here this morning. I was turned off. Now I'm ready. But it's good to be here this morning and just sing about the goodness and faithfulness of God and to continue our study through the book of Daniel and lessons from living in Babylon. As I study through this, I find all kinds of practical lessons to my life, to every day. And I've been very blessed by this study. As we continue this study of Daniel, I'd like to remember that we're looking for principles that we can live by as Christianity in America is increasingly becoming marginalized. And that's something that we're not used to. I was just listening to a couple years ago, I was at a conference. I heard a guy by the name of Andrew Brunson speak. Andrew Brunson spent 2 years in a Turkish prison. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later. But one thing he says is that the American church is lacking because we are not preparing our people to suffer. And when that time comes, there's going to be a falling away because we are not preparing people to do that. And I think I agree with him. That's why one reason I'm preaching this message is because we are going to be marginalized. There will be suffering. And so how do we live in this way, or how do we live in America in the time in which we live? And I would just like to review just some principles that we've learned so far in the first 2 chapters of Daniel. These principles are: commit before you get into a situation that you'll not defile yourself. Act with respect. Live so that your good behavior shames those that oppose Christ. Find what your superior's goals are and find ways to meet those goals without compromising your convictions. God can protect you, bless you, and advance you despite the system. Forgive the culture. Work for the good of the community in which you live. Plan to prosper. Don't shrink back. Become comfortable living from a position of weakness. Commit to prayer. Give God glory for your success. And God is always working, and His kingdom never fails. And those are the things that we've looked at so far. This is the 5th message on Daniel. So those first 5 messages, those are the things that we looked at. And as we go through this chapter here in Daniel 3, we're not going to be covering a lot of new principles, but we're going to see these principles played out in a different way. Remember, the first 2 verses of Daniel describe how Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem. He takes away articles and furniture and items from the temple. He brings and he takes them in the temple of his God. It was symbolizing that his God was greater than the God of Israel. And through the rest of Daniel then, it shows how God shows up in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, in the life of the people of Babylon, in the life of these Jewish people who are taken to a completely different culture, and lets them know that He's still in charge, that He's still all-powerful, and that He knows what's going on, and He's not afraid of what their circumstances that they're in. In chapter 2, Daniel's just a young guy, and he encounters Nebuchadnezzar, who's probably maybe mid to upper 20s. He's certainly not 30. And this is their first encounter with Nebuchadnezzar, with Jehovah God. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and Daniel interprets the dream for him, and he says, he saw this great statue, and the head of the statue is gold. And Daniel says, listen, you're the head of gold. And I don't know what all that went through Nebuchadnezzar's mind, but we read in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So it's almost like King Nebuchadnezzar could not get this image out of his mind. And so he gets up, he makes this, it is pretty heady stuff for a 25-year-old person to be told by the God of the universe that you've been given dominion, power, might, and glory. That's what God, through Daniel, told Nebuchadnezzar. You've been given dominion, power, might, and glory. And so I think this really went to Nebuchadnezzar's head, and he builds this image. And it's an image of gold. It's not like the image he saw. It was pure gold. And it was this tremendous display of wealth and power. And it was almost like Nebuchadnezzar was telling God, listen, you said I'm just the head. I'm just the head. That's not true. I'm the whole thing. I'm the whole thing. And God, you're wrong. I'm the whole image, and everyone is going to worship me. And that's what he set out to do. Going to verse 2, he says, he then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he set up. So all these people showed up for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. So he commanded everyone to come, and we don't know where Daniel is. It seems like at this time Daniel was probably serving in the court, but for whatever reason, I don't think he was there. He didn't attend, and he wasn't a provincial leader. He was leading in the court. But Daniel's three friends were there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were included in these dignitaries. So verse 4, then they heard a loud, this herald loudly proclaimed, this is what you're commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every tongue. As soon as you hear the sound of, and every time I'll read this, every time I'm just going to say music. I'm not going to name all these instruments. So when you hear the music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. So I don't think these officials knew what they were getting into. Almost as soon as they show up, they were given a life and death choice. You worship Nebuchadnezzar, or you're going to be burned alive. There's some choices that we have in life that we get to think about. This is coming, or you see it in your future, like, okay, so this is the decision that I'm going to need to make. Let me analyze it a little bit, see if this is compromise, or how should I, handle this situation. There's other situations that just show up, and it's like, you have to make a decision right now. There's not like you have any time to think. In those situations, you need to rely on your character. You need to rely on what God, your past commitment to God, those habits that you've built into following and listening to God. And in those quick decisions, it's often revealed what is in our heart. Do I worship the king or do I stand? Do I worship the king or do I die? So verse 7 goes on. It says, therefore, as soon as they heard the music, all the peoples of the nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So when the music played, everyone bowed down. People from all over the Babylon bowed down. This king was getting all the glory. And I can just imagine King Nebuchadnezzar just kind of sitting back and just, oh man, this feels good. Look at all these people worshiping me. This is very nice. And it really must have stoked his ego. Being asked to worship some kind of image or even worship leaders is not something that's new. Back in the early 1900s, up into World War II, Pyongyang, North Korea, was considered the capital, as they called it, the Jerusalem of the East. There were so many Christians in North Korea, in Pyongyang, that they called it the Jerusalem of the East. And Christianity was just spreading like crazy, lots of Christians, and the Japanese come in, and what they did, they set up, and Japanese at that time was set up on emperor worship, so they set a picture of the emperor in the churches, and they said, you can worship all you want, but when you come in, what we want you to do is just bow to that picture, and then you can do whatever you want after that. But we want you to bow to that picture. And so at first the church leaders are like, no, we're not doing that. And so people refused. And then what happened was the Japanese came in and arrested all the church leaders. And so the church leaders were like, well, they can't lead this church without us being there. And so what we decided that we'll do, we'll tell our congregation that they can bow to that image, but in their heart they know it's just out of respect and not out of worship. Now the ironic thing is that at the end of World War II, the Japanese surrendered to the Russians, and the Russians set up a communist dictator in North Korea. And it's based on emperor worship. That's the religion of North Korea. It's called junta. It's a perversion of Christianity. And for the last 75 years, 80 years, they've been forced to worship the emperor. Now, I don't know if there's a connection or not. Kind of an interesting side note is that when that happened, when communism took over North Korea, millions of Christians fled to South Korea. And today, if you go to South Korea, Christianity is the dominant religion in South Korea. There's about as many evangelical Christians, percentage-wise, in South Korea as there are in America. But today, we are faced with many choices. We might not be asked to bow down to the God, like to an emperor, a picture of an emperor. But we may be asked to bow down to the God of materialism, the God of LGBTQ+, the God of out-of-control nationalism, the God of sexual gratification. Will we bow down to the God of comfort? Will we stand when it seems like no one else has bowed down? And everyone else has bowed down. There's just a few standing. You know, for some of us, this is an academic exercise. You probably won't need to face that. For other of us, this is a real dilemma with real consequences. It's things that some of us have to discuss with our families. How do you think we should handle this situation? Do you know that if I do this, I may lose my job? What do you think we should do? Is that fine if that happens? Those are conversations that, for some of us, that is what we have to have. So how do we handle compromise in those situations? There's if you watch HGTV, there is several. I enjoy watching HGTV for whatever reason. It's some kind of mindless distraction. But there's a couple of people who really have done well. You know, Chip and Joanna Gaines they built this whole almost empire using their show on HGTV. You got the one set of twins, which I can't remember what their names are right now. They have this whole little empire. But there's another group of twins, the Benham brothers, and many of you maybe heard of them. Some of you maybe haven't. The Benham brothers they had a business in North Carolina, very successful business. They had worked with banks with foreclosures and buying foreclosures, remodeling them and selling them. And it was a very successful business. And HGTV comes in and they saw what they were doing and said, we'd like to make a show about your business. And they said, oh yeah, that'd be great. We can do that. And so everything was set up. I think it was supposed to be called Flip It Forward. And suddenly somebody was like, hey, do you know what these guys believe? They are very committed Christians. They do not believe that homosexuality is right. They believe it's sin, and they're not afraid to let people know that. And a whole list of things. And so what happened was they came to them and said, do you still believe this? They said, yes. They're like, well, your show's gone. They lost a huge financial gain, but they chose to stand. But what it has done, it has opened a lot of avenues of ministry for them. And but that was something they were asked to do, and they did not compromise. If you go to verse 8, it says, "At this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You've issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the music, all kinds of music, must fall down and worship the image of gold. And whatever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up.'" So if you read this, it seems like the king never would have known that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had stood and not bowed, had these other people not showed up and said, "Hey, king, we got 3 people here that didn't bow down." And it seems like they were just willing to quietly, firmly stand on their convictions. And it seems like if they had gone home that night, no one would have needed to know they had done anything special. No one would have needed to know what they've done. And they'd have been perfectly fine with that. You know, when they were asked, they didn't stage a protest. They didn't do any of that. They simply stood on their convictions, what they were going to do. They were not going to bow, and they were not going to compromise. Well, that brought them to the attention of the king. And in verse 13, he says, "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up?'" And you can almost hear this kind of condescending tone. Like, "I'll give you another chance. I'm just that gracious." You know? Now, when you hear the sound of the music, if you are ready, fall down and worship the image I've made. Very good. But if you do not worship, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then, and this is what it comes down to, because somehow Nebuchadnezzar knew this was really a battle between who was really God. Because then he says, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" You know, Nebuchadnezzar is furious. There's nothing like the anger of a wounded ego. And Nebuchadnezzar, he has this condescending tone. But I love the way these guys talk to him. Verse 16, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, 'O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up.'" You know, I love how they responded to him. It's basically they looked at the king and said, "You know what? We're just going to save you some time. We're just going to save you some time here. You know, we can hit replay on this and we can do all this over again, and in the end, the result's going to be the same. So let me just let you know. It doesn't matter what you do to us. We're not bowing down. And God may save us, but if he doesn't, it still doesn't matter. And we think that God alone deserves worship, not you. And no matter what, we are going to throw ourselves at the mercy of Jehovah, and we're not going to worship you." You know, this past week, I heard a man say, who was speaking to men, he said, "A man that loves Jesus for who he is and not for what he does. This is a man that cannot be touched." If we love and serve God because we perceive that it gives us a better chance of having a nice career, a beautiful family, and a nice life, we're not going to stand. A man or woman who loves Jesus for who he is and not for what he does cannot be touched. They love and worship him because of his majesty and glory. They serve him because he saved them. They have no expectation of material gains because of serving him. There is nothing that you can do that can control a person like that. There's nothing that you can do. There's nothing that, no carrot, no money, no prestige, no suffering that you can do to a person like that. There's no control. Who loves Jesus for who he is and not for what he can do for you. So is it any wonder that one of the first groups of people that a totalitarian regime will go after are Christians? Because they have no power. Because we don't live for things on this earth. We live for eternity. And that lack of power sometimes makes people go crazy. Completely crazy. And we've seen some of that craziness around us. It's because people lack that power. They lack control. And this is exactly what's happening here in the life of Daniel. In verse 19, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So now Nebuchadnezzar makes this super hot. He's not taking any chances because he understands that he thinks he's God, and he understands that he is going against Jehovah God, and he's not taking any chances. He's very angry. And the furnace is so hot that the people that throw them in die. I mean, this guy must have some power. If he can tell these guys to go throw in some people, and it's so hot that they die from the heat doing this command, carrying out this command. And he was going to show these 3 probably 19, 20, 21-year-old guys who really was in charge. Verse 24, it says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, Certainly, O king. And he said, Look, I see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed. The 4th looks like the son of the gods. So just imagine this scene. We get all these friends tied up. And I can imagine it take a while to do that. I don't know how fast they could do that. But they got them all tied up. It probably takes some time to get this furnace 7 times hotter. I don't know what kind of system they had, but they probably had to get these bellows going and all this air piping into that furnace and get it super hot. And then they go throw them in. The soldiers die. And King Nebuchadnezzar is just sitting there, and these guys just walk around. Not only do they walk around, there's another guy in the furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar is completely caught off guard. And he recognizes that 4th person is the Son of God. And this is one of the things that we can learn. God is, when you suffer, and I just realized I forgot to put this on my PowerPoint, and this is an important one. This is one of the most important ones. So you need to write this down. So when you face the consequences of your stand, you will find Jesus in your suffering. You may not feel his presence right away, but you'll find him. There's many testimonies of people who have suffered for Jesus who describe this unbelievable presence of God. And I think that does happen. And it probably happens to many, if not most people. That does not necessarily happen to everyone. Like I said, when I talked about Andrew Brunson was an American. The country of Turkey has really cracked down on Christianity. And they accused Andrew Brunson of being a spy. Basically put him up in a kangaroo court. He ends up in a Turkish prison in solitary confinement for mostly solitary confinement for 2 years. And he said, I always heard stories about how people would go to prison and they would feel the presence of God. He said, that was not my experience. He said, I went to prison and that first year was terrible. Because all I had was questions about who God was. why I was here and what he had for me and what the purpose of it was. And he said, the last 2 years, he said the last year of those 2 years was better. But he said every day he would wake up with fear, anxiety, and depression. And he said he'd wake up and he would choose to pray. And he said Richard Rembrandt, when he was in prison, he said that for Christianity, he said we're supposed to rejoice when people misuse us and abuse us. He said, so I'd take that as a command. And part of my Christian discipline every day, he said, I would get up, I would pray, I would sing, and I would dance. Every day. He said, and by the end of the day, I would feel like I was had the presence of God. And I'd wake up and need to do it all over again. And he said sometimes he would speak without feeling it. He would just hear himself praise God. And after that ordeal, someone told him, he said, well, maybe it was God's mercy that you didn't feel the presence like you thought you should, to reveal to you what your heart really was like. How your heart really did seek God despite those feelings. And Andrew Brunson was released. He's back in the States. He does a lot of speaking. But he did find Jesus in those times. Though he didn't feel like it all the time, he did find Jesus in those times. Verse 26 goes on, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I like this next part. Boy, it was like instant conversion. Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. So Nebuchadnezzar goes in the front of the furnace. He calls them out. He realizes that Jehovah God was the Most High God, and he realized there's no power greater than God. And because God has shown up, he's shown this king through the courage of these young men. And they don't smell like smoke. They're not burned. The only thing that was burned off was the ropes. A fire that was so hot that killed men throwing them in. You know, many times the Sunday school lessons stop right there. That's where they stop. But the story goes on. I think this is the real story. If you go to verse 28, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defiled the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their bodies be turned into piles of, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. I don't really endorse his tactics, but he certainly got the message out. You know, no one is going to speak against God, and everybody is going to know about God. The end result is that Nebuchadnezzar came to an understanding of who the true God really was. The willingness to die for God and the way that God came through was a powerful testimony of who God really was. And the end result was proclaimed through the whole empire, through the power of the Babylonian Empire itself. You know, if we're going to suffer, and I think, and there's all kinds of suffering, some of the times it's personal suffering, not only suffering that we have because we stand up for God, but suffering that we have in our personal life. We're going to need to hold on to the fact that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and he knows what's going on. And he has a plan. There's nothing beyond his control. He has a plan. And God, because he's God, his plan is that everybody knows who he is. That's his plan. And we are, as individuals, I like that John Piper quote. He says, God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in him. God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in him. And to think that God wants to be known is something that we're like, that sounds arrogant. It is for us, but for God it's not. It's actually an act of mercy, because as we know God, we come to a deepest satisfaction of who we are and who he is. And God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in him. If you go back about a little over 100 years before these guys were in Babylon, standing before Nebuchadnezzar, you had King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah, he has a disease, and he thinks he's going to die, and he calls the prophet in. The prophet Isaiah comes and tells him he's going to die. And Hezekiah cries out to God, and before Isaiah leaves the palace, God tells him, go back and say, you got another 15 more years. So Isaiah comes back and he tells Hezekiah, you have another 50 years, or another 15 years. And so Hezekiah praises God. And one of the signs was that God was going to heal was that the sun would actually move backwards. And so that's what happened. The sun moved backwards. And for whatever reason, the country, before it was an empire, the envoys from Babylon came to visit Jerusalem. Now, if you go back, when the temple was dedicated in King Solomon's temple, his prayer was that the nations of the world, as they come to Jerusalem, they come to see the temple, that the nations of the world would know who the one true God is. That was his prayer. That was one of the purposes of the temple, was that the nations of the world would know who the one true God is when they come to the temple. So these Babylonian envoys come, and Hezekiah shows them all his riches, all his wealth, everything that he has, all the wealth of the temple, and never mentions God. Never fulfills the purpose that God set them out to fulfill. 100 years later, the empire of Babylon is declaring to the whole empire who God is. Isn't that amazing? The providence of God. Sometimes we think that we can screw up God's plan, that we can mess it up, that because we have done things that are so messed up that God can't fulfill his divine purposes. God is not that way. You look at the children of Israel, they turned their back on God, yet God used them turning their back on him to use the empire to spread his glory. God's providence. And when we are in the midst of suffering, when we don't know what's going on, we have to trust in the providence of God. Because that is when we know that God is glorified and his name can be made famous. Because when we're right in the middle of the suffering that God has placed us in, whether that is because of we're standing up for Jesus or just personal suffering that life brings us, we have to hang on to the providence of God, that he knows what is going on. He has a divine purpose, and he knows, and he has his goodness for us, even though we can't see it. One other thing that I found very interesting about Andrew Brunson, as he was going through this time where he said, a whole year of solitary confinement, not feeling the presence of God, and he was, by the way, they wanted to charge him, I think it was like 3 life sentences. So if he was convicted and charged, he was never going to see his family again. He was going to be in that prison forever. And so that first year, he said, was absolutely horrible. He said every time he came to God, he had questions. Every time he came to God, he would ask God why this happened. He said, I finally said, you know what, God? I'm not getting answers. And he said, I just imagined this safe. And I took that safe and I opened it and I put all these questions that anytime I came to God, I didn't worship him, I didn't seek him. The only thing I did was question him. He said, I took those questions and I put them in a safe. And I locked that safe. And I'd come to God and I would just worship him. And I told God, listen, I don't know if I'll get answers to these, but I'm going to worship you for who you are. And when you're ready, you can take those questions out, and I'll be happy to know the answers. He rested on the sovereignty of God. Verse 30. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. God can protect you, bless you, and advance you despite the system. But to believe that, to know that, even if he doesn't, just like they said, if he doesn't, I'm not going to compromise, because I believe in the goodness and the providence of God. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. Thank you that we could be here. Thank you for your providence. And Lord, we don't know what life may hold and how we will be asked to stand. But Lord, I pray that you would give us the grace to do that. I pray, Lord, that we would hold on to you. We would not be willing, not bow down to the things that everyone else around us is bowing down. And Lord, you may call us to suffering, but if we don't, we know that you're God, we know that you're sovereign, and we know that even in the midst of our suffering, you have a purpose for that. I want to thank you that you're in control and that your plan and purpose for this world, there's nothing that can stop it. Even when we stand against you, even when we don't listen to you, there's nothing that can stop that plan. And you're coming back, and all the world will know that you are King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and every single person will see you for your glory and bow down and worship you, not because you make them, but because they see you for who you are. Thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.